Norman Bloom, the man, the myth, the legend. Hi, I'm Don Paul. Welcome to my podcast, Bits o' Blather on weather, climate, and some humor. And today I'm going to toss aside science for this episode and get into what I believe contains some humor, and it's all true. Now, you may not believe it, but at least I have some shreds of evidence to support the story of Norman Bloom, who owned the Dairy Queen in my hometown, North Bergen, New Jersey. It's the part of Jersey where a lot of us talk like this, Tony Soprano country. And this Dairy Queen, owned and operated by a graduate engineer. Norman had a degree in one of the engineering disciplines, a bachelor's degree from the Newark College of Engineering, which is now the New Jersey Institute of Technology, I believe. And the Dairy Queen was very successful, despite being what had to be the filthiest Dairy Queen in the chain, as I said. And it could only have survived with such poor sanitation in a place like Hudson County. With the rampant corruption, any health inspectors tended to do a cash and carry business with a lot of uh, the business owners. And it happened that teenage boys, in particular, don't really worry about a filthy franchise. They want the ice cream or a sundae. Hey, so what? But I do recall walking Helen home from North Bergen High School, whom I finally worked up the nerve to ask to the senior prom. I had bought her a cherry dipped vanilla cone, and when he handed it to us through the window, she saw his fingernails. And we walked away, and she handed it to me and said, "Here, you eat it." That's the kind of place it was. Well, Norman, for anyone who worked for him, became more and more obsessed with numerology. He really thought the symbolism of several numbers was very important in the advance or decline of human civilization. And the one number he feared more than any was five. He associated the number five with death. And it had gotten to the point where my friend Gary said he would no longer handle fives from customers. If someone walked up and wanted to pay with a five, he had one of the kids working there handle the whole transaction. By the way, Gary had a story about that wonderful sanitation. Um, a glass bottle of pineapple sundae topping was dropped, the glass broke, and Norman had, I think, Gary pick up whatever pineapple was not touching the floor with what I don't know and put it into the sundae topping container and then clean up the pineapple and the broken glass from the floor. That's the kind of Dairy Queen it was. Well, his numbers fixation got worse and worse. And by my maybe freshman or sophomore year in college, I was home for a weekend, and uh, Gary and my friend Howie and I, and maybe another friend, were in Greenwich Village on a nice spring Saturday night. And we saw in front of what was then a famous bookstore, the 8th Street bookstore, we saw Norman Bloom handing out pamphlets that he'd begun handing out at Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, where my friend Howie went to college. Uh, he had on these pamphlets a declaration that he, Norman, was the new Messiah, and all of his messianic strengths and links were tied into numerology. And he had these sentences all over the pamphlet about how this number meant this, and it did warn about five, of course. Well, we saw Norman, and we decided we were going to walk toward him chanting like robot zombies. Five, five, five. And we crossed, I think, 6th Avenue and started heading toward the front of the bookstore. And here's a coincidence. This one I can't prove, but it's a true story. A cab pulled up, and a passenger opened the door and said, "Anyone here have five singles for a five?" I'm guessing he didn't want to tip the cabbie a whole $5. And he said it like 2, 3 times pretty loudly. And that was the last time we ever saw Norman Bloom. Norman, with his pamphlets, just took off down the street and disappeared into the darkness. That just put him off. Well, to get ahead to closer to the end of this story about Norman, years later, I was working in 1979 at WJBK, the CBS station then in Detroit. And my friend Howie, who had gone on to change his name pretty much to Howard because he was a successful real estate person, Howie told me that I needed to get or see the new Carl Sagan book, Broca's Brain, which is still in print. And I had happened to see Carl Sagan, a frequent guest of Johnny's, uh, plugging the book, but also discussing the subject matter. And I said, Howie, what's the big deal about the book? He says, it's a book, by the way, concerning the anthropology of the human brain and our different capacities, how some people waste gifts and don't make contributions, others purposely go into junk science, others accidentally go into it. And Howie would not give me even a hint of why I had to see this book. So I went to the Birmingham, Michigan bookstore, and there it was because it was already on the bestseller list. And I opened it up, and the table of contents, chapter headings, I think it was chapter 8, Norman Bloom, Messenger of God, or as Dan Aykroyd would say, Messenger of God. And my eyes just glazed over. I was seeing it. You know that feeling that I must be dreaming this? But Howie had warned me. And I started asking myself, how could this happen? And I came up with a reasonable hypothesis. I think Norman decided he wanted to step up from Fairleigh Dickinson and branch out, and he began heading up to Ithaca and hanging out on the Cornell campus, where Carl Sagan was the David Duncan Professor of Astronomy. And I have a friend who was a meteorology major at Cornell, and he said one of the joys was occasionally you'd see Sagan having a bull session with students on a street corner on the campus, talking about science, scientific illiteracy, and how that was dangerous. And my hypothesis is that he saw this strange looking man and the pamphlets, and either a pamphlet was pushed into his hand or he took a pamphlet. How else could Dr. Carl Sagan come to know a little bit about Norman Bloom? And in the book, I lost my copy, but I seem to recall Norman was a person whom he thought had a mathematical gift, but unfortunately it was accompanied by either neuroses or psychoses, so his entire gift was wasted. And it's a fascinating book. That's the book in which Sagan said something I fervently agree with. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, but that's another subject for another episode. Anyway, uh, years later, I was coming home from Channel 4 one night, and Larry King was still doing his overnight radio show, and it was open phones. And as I'm pulling in, I hear, Larry, what happened to the numbers guy? Oh, you mean Norman Bloom? Yeah, that guy. He used to call all the time. I haven't heard him. Well, sadly, Norman passed away a couple of months ago. We just found out recently. And that is the final note on a man who had great influence over at least 5 or 6 North Bergen boys and did leave a mark on us. I'm not sure it's a good mark, but Norman could have done better. I guess you could say that, but he certainly was not a boring personality. I hope you found this entertaining and accept it as a true allegory about it, this character, Norman. And I'll be going back to science in the next episode if you didn't. But if you're enjoying this episode or the podcast in general, please share, please follow. I'm on all the major platforms now: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Amazon, all of them essentially. And by the way, I know on Spotify you can interact with me and offer critiques, offer suggestions for future episodes, and I'll be glad to look into them if I'm competent to handle a particular topic. So I will be talking to you again back from the realm of science in just a day or two. Thanks for listening this far.